Maybe, Paul, you will introduce yourself, even though I mentioned your
Well,
name.
since Maria has just already done that, I work at Queen Mary Westfield College in London. I'd like to ask you, Noam, about something that you said in response to a couple of questions back, namely about words not having real-world reference. I suppose what I'd like to point out is that some of those cases seem to be cases that are not accessible or not easily accessible to consciousness. So, for example, the word house, you pointed out all these strange features of it, both now and in your writings, but I think it really takes, someone to point out those kinds of features before people realize them. With other examples, though, I think the oddness, or let's just say the fact that these phrases don't have real-world reference, seems more easily accessible. So, for example, another sentence of yours, I think it goes something like, "The bank moved across the road after burning down."
Yeah.
Which seems at first like a perfectly straightforward sentence. In English, we can all more or less reconstruct the train of events, but then when you reflect on it for just a second, you think, that's funny, there can be nothing, no real object can have A, burned down and then moved across the road, which is the point of the example. So my question is, at least for the latter kind of examples, how is it that we're able to use those sentences so easily to convey truths? Because it seems on first inspection at least that, if a sentence either asserts or presupposes the existence of an object that does not exist, and indeed in many of these cases an object that could not exist, it seems on first inspection like they should either just come out false, or that they should come out as, presupposition failures.
Actually, I should mention that Paul is the only person who writes on semantics who takes any of this seriously, so it's unique. But I think what it means is just that most of what we do is unreflective. It's kind of like seeing a rigid object in motion or seeing the moon illusion, or understanding other people. We have the slightest idea how we do it. We can't introspect into our own behavior any more than we can introspect into falling bodies. I mean, it's just intuitively obvious that if you have two objects of different mass, the one with a larger mass is going to fall faster. Well, this turns out to be false, but it's if we can't introspect into something as simple as, say, falling bodies, or why some things fall and others rise, how can we hope to introspect into anything as complicated as what the human mind is doing? You've got to study it from the outside, the way you study other things. And when you do, it's very hard. There are illusions about, one of the main illusions goes through all of intellectual history, is that somehow we ourselves ought to be the easiest thing to study because we can look into what's going on. So, say, Tom Nagel asks what it's like to be a bat, and nobody can give the answer. But try answering the question, what it's like to be me. I mean, I don't think anybody can answer that question either. At least I can't. You can't pose questions like that. They don't mean anything. To figure out what it's like to be me, or a bat, or a nematode, or no matter how simple it is a hard scientific question. And to ask what it's like to be a person, even yourself, is maybe one of the hardest questions. You can write novels about it, or write poetry about it or something, but you can't give a discursive account. You can't answer the question. I think we can't hope to answer the kinds of questions that you're talking about just by introspection. Somehow when people use the word bank, let's say, they automatically understand what you just brought out. And they don't find it confusing unless you point out to them, look, this technically doesn't make any sense. And then you get things like, say, Kripke's puzzles. But the puzzles arise because you're trying to present in a rational form that's somehow objective things that are handled by people in a totally different way.
If I may ask a very
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess
He
my
gets a
worry-
special dispensation because he takes it
Paul
seriously.
gets special dispensation.
So I guess my worry is that, does this commit us to the existence of two systems that are capable of analyzing sentences like that? There's, I guess the normal semantic interpretation system, which is indeed inaccessible to consciousness, as you say, but then there's this other faculty by which we come along and say, that's funny.
Yeah.
But it seems that this other faculty is itself doing some kind of semantic analysis of those sentences. And so we seem to be left with a kind of, what words from the, on the face of it look like a slightly ontologically costly system, whereby we have two systems that can do some kind of semantic analysis.
Well, I think we have to set up two different systems. There's our many different systems. In fact, I think there's probably a high level of modularity in the mind. One of our capacities, we call it a science-forming capacity, which every has in some fashion, is to try to make sense of our experience in a coherent way. I mean, Russell once pointed out that the only thing we're really confident about is our own immediate experience. And the rest of inquiry, including all of science, is to try to give some coherent account of what this experience is. And I think that's basically right. This science-forming capacity, which children use to make sense of the world, that primitive tribes use and so on, is just a different one. It's also trying to make sense of the use of language. So, for example, when a child, let's say, if present you in a Piagetian type experiment where something moves and something else moves, the child will automatically set up an invisible contact between them. There's got to be some invisible mechanical thing that's causing them to interact, because that's just the way we see the world. In fact, that's a major event in the history of science. It was when Newton showed that it doesn't work, when he demonstrated that what was called then the mechanical philosophy, the assumptions about the nature of the world that were made by every great scientist, Galileo, Leibniz, Descartes, Huygens, everyone, and Newton himself, he believed it. That's why he regarded his discoveries as an absurdity that no person with any scientific understanding could pay any attention to, but they just happened to be true. That you can't have a mechanical universe, that you have what he and others regarded as a kind of occult property, action without contact. It can't happen. And our intuitive way of understanding the world just happens to be different from the way the world appears when we apply our science-forming capacities to it. That was a wrenching moment. In fact, it changed the whole nature of science. So for Galileo, the great scientist of the early modern period, the goal of science was to show that the world is intelligible. Post-Newton, it changed. It took a long time for it to sink in, but basically changed. We give up the hope of understanding the world. We just try to understand theories about the world, which is totally different. And you get apparent contradictions, like Hume, who understood this, pointed out that Newton's greatest achievement was to show that there are mysteries which we will never comprehend. He was referring to things like action without contact, interaction without contact. On the other hand, you get modern scientists and philosophers like David Deutsch, David Abraham, many others, in fact, generally, who condemn what's called Mysterianism. That is, there are things that we cannot comprehend. That's Dan Dennett, lots of others. This is some kind of pathology, because in principle we can understand anything. Well, what they're claiming is something quite, they have already internalized the change of the conception of science from trying to discover an intelligible world given up by the time Newton's discoveries sank in, to trying to discover intelligible theories. And maybe we can develop an intelligible theory about anything, about almost anything, maybe anything you can think of. But that doesn't mean that the world's going to be intelligible. So Mysterianism just almost has to be true. I think it was proven by Newton, in fact, though he didn't like it. He thought it was absurd. Hume recognized it, look, it's true, what can we do with it? Locke recognized it. So Locke, one of his great insights was, what's called Locke's suggestion in the history of philosophy, that he said that just as there are, he put it to theological framework, but we can extract it from that. What he said is, just as God added to matter properties which we cannot comprehend, like action at a distance, so God might have superadded to matter a faculty of thinking. It's the hypothesis of thinking matter, which was then, it kind of opened up the possibility of really having a scientific psychology. It was kind of dropped for a couple of centuries, but that's it, basically. And you have to try to figure out, well, what is the property of whatever's in there that allows thinking. But I think that gets right back to your question. We can, with our scientific capacities, we can look at this and say, hey, there's something really wrong here. We have to have another system for describing it, which doesn't have these internal contradictions. And that's just a different system than what we call common sense, or ordinary ways of looking at things. And within that system, you can develop, in fact, you try to develop a notion of reference. So in, say, physics or linguistics or any other kind of organized inquiry, you hope that the entities that you construct, mental entities that you construct, symbolic entities, you hope that they actually pick out something that exists in the world. So if scientists think they found the Higgs boson, they would like to believe that there is a Higgs boson out there, And if linguists talk about phonemes, they'd like to say, yeah, there's something real that's a phoneme. But that's a totally different notion from the ones in our ordinary language. In fact, this leads to a lot of problems in contemporary philosophy, I think. Like, take the whole twin Earth discussions, or the idea that, the water is H2O, and all of those discussions. They're just mixing up two different systems. You can't ask whether water is H2O in natural language, say English, because it doesn't have the word H2O. That's from another system. You can't ask whether water is H2O in chemistry, because it doesn't have the word water. Of course, chemists use it informally, but they have H2O and not water. There's no, if you actually look at what water is in human language, it's a very complex notion. It has nothing to do with H2O, of course. But so even, you can't even pose the questions that are discussed in the twin Earth literature because of mixing two quite distinct systems. It's kind of curious because the philosophers who develop these systems believe something that comes from Quine and Wittgenstein and so on, that words don't have meaning except inside a language. Okay. Well, if you believe that, then if you mix up two languages, it's going to be incoherent. You know? And so you'll get what looks like a sentence, water is H2O, but water is getting its meaning from English, and H2O is getting its meaning from chemistry. And chemistry is a system which at least strives to have reference. That's the whole point of science. And English is a system that doesn't strive to do anything. It's just like walking. It's what it is. You know? And it doesn't happen to have reference.